If the statistic is true, in any given year, 110 million people will attend a church assembly. Now, to put that in perspective, again, if the statistics are true, that's more than will attend a football game, baseball game, basketball game, or tennis match, all in a single year. 110 million people attending. The question comes, however, why? Why do we need a church family? Why do we need a church family? I spent some time talking about identifying characteristics of the Lord's church. And I want to put a peg on that, an exclamation mark on that, with this sermon. Because sometimes I think we take for granted, unless we go through some experience like we've had recently, the church family that we have. Maybe some time of dire distress happens, and we rally around one another, but in a common day in, day out kind of monotonous routine of life, we all have our ways that we go, a dozen or more different directions. And until we see one another here, may not give a thought to somebody else the rest of the time. What makes this different than Lions Club? What makes this different than the Kiwanis? What makes it different than the Cancer Society or the Heart Society? What makes it different? Why do we need a church family? Why would 110 million people find it important to attend a church assembly and therefore be part of a church family? Why? Well, I have 5 things I want to share with you this morning that I think help us see that. The first that we see is we need a church family to center our life around worship. We need a church family to help center our life around worship. God should not just be a write-in on our calendar. God is intended to be and wants to be the center of our lives. It's not that we have our lives filled with all of our activities and God is worked in. It's that God is at the center of our life and everything else filters out from that. If God is not at the center of our life and worship taking place, then there's something else likely taking place. It is generally either God is the center in worship or God's not the center in worry. Worry is a strong indicator that God is not at the center of our lives. Panic, fearful, anxious, prone to worry, prone to be anxious. But the Lord said when answering a question, the first and greatest, get those 2 words, the first and greatest commandments are to love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, and all thy mind. What he's just said there is God is to be in the absolute center of our lives. In fact, it's God's desire that what we do is we search for Him and we know Him. We grope for Him. Paul will say in Acts chapter 17 and verse 29, we grope for Him that we may know Him. It's God's desire that we know Him. But when worry is at the center of our lives, anxiety is at the center of our lives, then God's not at the center of our lives. There's something else that's animating and motivating us. To say it that way, the Lord said, speaking to the woman at the well about worship. She asked a question about worship. Is it in Mount Gerizim or is it in Jerusalem? He said, the time is coming where it's not going to make a difference worth a plug nickel. Okay, that's Rickie's version. It's not going to make a plug nickel worth of difference whether you do it in Jerusalem or Gerizim, because what God is seeking is He's seeking the kind of people who will worship Him in truth and in spirit. What He's saying there is He wants people to be genuine about it. He wants people who will genuinely have God at the center of their lives. He wants people who genuinely are spiritually minded and spiritually attuned to God. We look at that as truly spiritual, as truly one, spiritual two. There's a nice little Greek connection there that is a lesson for a different time. But what it simply means is the second modifies the first, which means He wants people whose worship is truly spiritual. He wants it genuine. Yes, He wants it accurate. But He wants worship that is truly spiritual. He's saying, is there anybody here that wants a relationship with me? Is there anybody here that really wants to know me? We can't just say, I love God, and then go about our way. We might say, well, I think God is like. Well, it doesn't matter what we think God is like. God's not interested in what we think about what He's like. We need to know what God says He's like. In Romans chapter 11, verse 33, in a different context, but the question is valid. Who did God take into His counsel? Did God ask our advice about what we think He ought to be like? No. It is our challenge to get to know Him and get to know what He is like as He is described, not how we want Him described. And that's one significant difference. If you're part of the Lions Club or the Rotary Club or just part of the Cancer Society, you can make that what you like. There's no eternal rules, no eternal truths that are governing that. But if we're going to be people who have God at the center of our life, it's not a matter of what I like. It's a matter of whether I truly love God or not. In Acts chapter 2, I want you to see this. Beginning in verse 40. Acts chapter 2, beginning in verse 40. And we know the words that He testified and exhorted them, saying, be saved from this perverse generation. Then those that gladly received His word were baptized, and that day about 3,000 souls were added to them. And they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine, fellowship, breaking of bread, and prayer. Then fear came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were done through all the apostles. Do you see what happened here? The word was preached. People were brought to Jesus. And now then it says, they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine. They're sitting at the feet of the apostles, and the apostles are still teaching, the apostles are still preaching. Fellowship and breaking of bread. What they did was coming together. Here they've obeyed the gospel of Christ, and now then they're trying to implant God at the center of their life by continuing with the apostles, continuing in fellowship with one another, and continuing breaking bread with one another. They're continuing to do that. And so when we think about why we need a church family, our church family helps remind us. It helps remind us of the importance of having God at the center of our lives. As Jason said, there's so many things that encroach our life and our thinking, that sometimes it's easy just to move the intangible out because of the tangible. But when we come to worship, at least for this period of time, we are reminded of something that is vitally, vitally important. But there's something else that takes place in Acts chapter 2. It says in verse 46, so continuing daily with one accord in the temple and breaking bread from house to house, they ate their food with gladness and simplicity of heart. It's not just that they came together like this. It's that the value they had in getting to know one another and keeping God at the center of their lives by having one another do that was found in a smaller type of association together. It's wonderful to come to an audience of something like 400 people like this. But it is impossible to get to know intimately one on 400. It is estimated that there are 3,000 souls that obey the gospel here. that were added to those who are already part of the Lord. Statistically, it's been by research and archaeology, it's estimated that there were approximately 100,000 people in the church at Jerusalem at this time. And that the population of Jerusalem might have been 200,000. Now, do the math real quick. What they're saying is about half the people in the city are Christians, if those stats are right. If archaeology and research has determined that and it's correct, over half were Christians. How is one going to get to know 100,000? It's not. We come together like this and remind of it, but the value is, what did they do in a smaller setting? Just for example, we have the congregation divided up into 8 different groups. Group outreach, work groups, however you want to describe them. Ron and Kevin do a good job of helping us stay connected in that way. How am I going to get to know you and you get to know me? How are we going to get to know each other? We have some newer members. How are these newer members going to get to know each other, one another? How are we going to do that? We can come like this, and we can be here for 6 months and still sit on our side of the auditorium and not know each other. But notice what they did. It says, so continuing daily in one accord in the temple and breaking bread from house to house. They got together. They spent time with one another, and that time with one another helped them as a church family, not just in a collective way like this, but in an individual way in our homes, help keep us centered on God. If I'm not taking advantage of the opportunities in smaller settings to get to know my brethren and my brethren get to know me, how can I possibly be an encouragement to them to help them stay centered on God? The value of a church family is not just seen when we come together collectively. It's that I have you and you have me. And when I have you in my home, you have me in your home, when we sit down for coffee, when we sit down for donuts, when we sit down for nutrisystem dessert, whatever you want to have, we sit down together and we are what? We are enjoying each other and getting to know each other more intimately. That's what they did. We need a church family because it helps us stay centered around God through our worship. Second, it helps us stay connected to our fellow believers through fellowship. Notice again what he will say in verse 42. They continue steadfast in the apostles' doctrine and fellowship. And fellowship. He wants fellow believers to be part of fellow believers. He wants, first of all, us to love God with all our heart, soul, and mind. But second is, he wants us to be part of a family. In 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 22, seeing you have obeyed through the hearts, with sincerity of heart, fervently love one another. God said through John, God is love, therefore, if God is love, that's what we ought to be. If God is love and He has loved us, what He's saying is, I've loved you, but now you love each other because I want you to have that relationship with each other. And 2 things in heaven that we're going to do. We're going to worship God, and we're going to be with fellow believers. And those are 2 things we're going to have in heaven. Those things ought to be of utmost importance for us today. How many times do we stay self-centered as opposed to God-centered? And being self-centered, focusing inwardly on self. We don't develop relationships. We don't develop relational skills. And we don't develop ability to love somebody else because we stay self-centered, not God-centered. When I think about that, I think about the value we have in having brothers and sisters. The term brother and sister, they're family terms. They're terms that speak of an intimate relationship with each other. It grows out of the nuclear family to then spill over to this family. And so what he's saying here is, I want you to be part of one another. What he's saying here is, the time is going to come in our life that we're going to have storms. If you hold your finger there in Acts chapter 2, turn to 1 Peter chapter 3. 1 Peter chapter 3, 1 Timothy chapter 3, I want you to read verse 15. Verse 14, he says, "These things I write to you, that though I hope to come to you shortly, if I am delayed, I write so that you may know how you ought to conduct yourself in the house of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and ground of truth." The church, the pillar and ground of truth. The church offers a stable, firm footing with one another. Our lives can be prone to shift. And when our lives shift, where is our firm foundation going to be? Who is going to be our ground? Who's going to be our support? You see, God wants us to live a balanced life. Just like we have 2 eyes, 2 legs, 2 feet, 2 arms. Everything in the body is to be balanced. He wants us to live a balanced life. But when we are prone to shift and those shifts come, when the plates shift and the earthquake happens and our feet are along on firm foundation, firm standing, firm ground, who are we going to have to depend upon? There was supposed to be a picture that came up there. And I didn't have it. Well, phooey. Let me describe that picture for you. I was so proud of myself. Dana worked hard on getting this, and I did some extra work on myself and found some pictures. I thought, hey, if Jordan can do it, I can do it. And so I found a picture of an earthquake in California in 1989. And the ground had shifted, and this one guy standing there, and the ground's about to fall out from under him. That was the picture. It was supposed to come up so you could say, wow. That's the point I'm trying to make. The point is, who are we going to turn to? Who's going to be the person or persons we're going to turn to that have that firm, unshakable foundation for us? Who's the someone or someones that I know can absolutely I can turn to, and they'll be there as my ground and my support? We need other believers for that. Third, we also need to cultivate spiritual maturity through discipleship. Back to Acts chapter 2 once again. Notice what he says in verse 47. Praising God and having favor with all the people, and the Lord added to the church daily those who were being saved. He wants us to have spiritual maturity. That spiritual maturity is true wisdom, true obedience, development of character. God is saying, I want you to help each other develop in your maturity, in your character. But it's not just character. It's also growing in our skills. Hebrews chapter 5 and verse 11. He would talk, when for the time you ought to be teachers, one teach you again the first principles of the oracles of God. He said the time's come in which you should be developing some kind of skill. It's not just character we develop. That's the primary thing. But he said you also need to be taking the opportunity to teach somebody else. Now, let's pause just a moment. When we talk about teaching somebody else, how can we do that? Well, we can do it through instruction. But let me tell you the most powerful way we can teach. It's by our example. If we go about living a godly life, that's the most powerful teaching tool we can have. Noah talked about personal evangelism this morning. The gospel is for all people, for all times, and all situations. The best use of the gospel is seen when we can develop that Christ-like character and we can give that as an example to others. Our church family helps provide that kind of example of people who are mature. When we have people that we look up to, Michael very eloquently led the prayer. Thanking God for the elders and for the evangelists, for the deacons. People that we can look up to. Powerful words, Michael. Thank you. What he's saying is here, somebody I can set as a model. Because of why? Because of their example. That's what our church family helps provide for us. We have in this church family example after example after example of being a believer in times when our feet are prone to shift out from under us. Fourth, and had a good picture on this one too, I'll describe in just a moment. To give through serving. Our church family helps us learn to give back through serving. What did Jesus say in Matthew chapter 25, verses 35 through 46 about entering into eternal life? You remember you have the 10 virgins, you have the talents, and then he comes and says what? You gave somebody a drink of water, you put some clothes on somebody's back, and you visited them in prison. And they say, when did we do that? He said, when you did it to the least of these. What he's saying is, I want you to practice serving today. I want you to practice being a part of and serving each other today. If you were to take tennis lessons, one of the things they do in practicing tennis is to practice the serve. What Jesus is saying is one day you're going to serve me, but today I want you to practice serving me by serving others. Anytime you can reach down to help someone, to provide a need for someone, he says we are offering service one to another. If there's a grandmother that is on her walker and she's walking along and her little 3-year-old granddaughter is reaching up and helping her grandmother walk, here is something that this little girl is doing to help serve her grandmother. Here's something every one of us can do. Every one of us can find an opportunity somehow, some way, with someone to serve somebody. We develop our spiritual maturity. We develop our sense of attainment with one another as believers by pouring our hearts out in serving one another. Remember what Paul was saying in Romans chapter 12? Though there are many members, we are one body. In 1 Corinthians chapter 12, he uses the body again. An eye, a hand, a foot, an ear. How can you say one without the other? How can we say we can do one without one another? How can we say one is the least, one's the most important? Because each serve a purpose by providing a service for one another. Our church family reminds us we can have opportunities to reach out and serve other people. But then finally, I want you to see our church family helps us also communicate the gospel through sharing the message. Noah talked about that word evangelize. We obey the gospel and we're raised from that watery grave a new creature. Why doesn't God just transport us there? He didn't leave us here to sin, but He left us for a greater purpose. And He says, here's the good news. I created you special to be somebody. And here's the rest of the good news. I created you for a special purpose. And what I want you to do is I want you to take that special purpose. And all I want you to do, and here's my last picture, is take this Bible and hand it to somebody. That's all I want you to do. Somebody took this Bible and handed it to you. All I'm asking you to do is take this Bible that contains a good story, good news, and I want you to hand it to somebody. Can we find somebody to serve? Can we find somebody just to give a Bible to? Did someone do that for me and did someone do that for you? Did someone share that good news Noah talked about with me and with you? But now let me bring it back home again. the best message that you can possibly preach when you hand this Bible to somebody. That's our example. The strongest personal work evangelism tool we have is our example. And when we take this book and we hand it to somebody because we have an example that follows what this book is, they may open it to a book like the book of Luke and decide to read something about the book of Luke, who set things in order concerning the life of Christ. And next thing you know, find out this is not filled with dry, dusty, boring stories. This is filled with stories that help you come alive. This tells a story about a period of time in history where there was a guy that was going to be a governor of a place. There was a census that took place. And people came to Jerusalem to keep that census so they could have the count and the taxes that were due the Caesar. Do you realize Octavian was the first Caesar? The first guy who became a Roman emperor was killed, and then there was a battle, and Octavian won and called himself a Caesar, Augustus Caesar. And there's a ruler named Quirinius that's there. And he's going to collect taxes. He's going to count people. And people have come there that day to do that. Do you know that secular history corroborates that event? And that's one of the signature things that begin to tell the story in Luke chapter 2 about the life of Jesus and the history of that time. We sing the song. Tell me the story. The old story. Our church family helps remind us. Telling people the Bible, serving, is not just for preachers, elders, and deacons and super saints. Using those terms accommodatively. Our church family reminds us everybody here has a place and has a purpose. Everybody here can serve. Everybody here can help somebody else stand on solid ground. Everybody here can help each other mature. Everybody here can be a voice for one another. Everybody here can help somebody share the Bible. Our church family offers us a powerful, powerful motivation to help us keep God at the center of our lives. But how many of us are plagued with the disease of procrastination? Or somebody else can do it. And I'll just wait for a better day till somebody else comes along and does it for me. When all I need to do is to speak, to shine, invite, to welcome, and to pray. That was Jordan's lesson 2 weeks ago. Don't you see our church family offers us powerful incentive as people of God? It's not like anything else, any other relationship save marriage. Christ died to purchase a people with His blood, to add them to His church. And if we can help you do that this morning, then won't you come while we stand and while we sing?